Good morning, everybody. It is fantastic to open this webinar, the second in our series of sustainable recovery. Delighted to have with us Joseph from the Green Climate Fund. Thank you, Joseph, for being here. And Andrea Bassi from CEO of KnowlEdge and also a very, very senior associate at IISD. Welcome, Andrea. And in this webinar, we are going to explore why simulation is very important to plan a sustainable recovery. Because you see, when we design policies today, we need to understand how they're going to play out in the market in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And this market is so full of uncertainties. There are the climate uncertainties, there are the economic uncertainties, there are the employment opportunity uncertainties, there are the technological challenges. So simulation is very important because it allows us to look forward, to predict, to run scenarios, to demystify the future a little bit. And we are wanting governments and policymakers to actually begin to look to one sector that has been using simulation, climate early warning, and learn from it. So that's the objective for this next half hour. And welcome to our listeners. Please keep your questions rolling in. We're going to address them as we go along. There's not going to be a formal Q&A. Q&A is ongoing. And thank you to Sophia Balinho, our head of communications, for making the time to be here yourself. Thank you, Sophia. We appreciate it. So we start with Joseph. Joseph, you're an expert in climate early warning. Simulation is your second nature, if I may say so. What are the salient features that we can draw from climate early warning and related simulation to plan an economy?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have me on this very important seminar. Climate information and early warning systems are very critical in terms of how we plan and manage resources to adapt to the impact of climate change. To give you a typical example of the usefulness of climate information and early warning system, when you look at 2017, the disasters that the hurricanes and the systems that developed in the Caribbean and the US, they were so critical in determining how the tracks would look like, where the impacts will be, and then also enable us to even estimate what the impact is going to be and help people to get them out of harm's way. So the power of simulation is able to use science and mathematics and physics to really understand the evolution of systems and processes. And that helps us to inform decision-making to save lives, assets, and properties. And so in the context of climate information and early warning system, it is so important in terms of how we better plan. I mean, it gives us the opportunity to plan in terms of giving us a lead time to really understand what the impacts will look like. And it's more important to understand that disasters actually arise as a result of hazards interacting with vulnerable social conditions. So you could have stronger resilience against certain types of hazard that will not lead to disasters. But if you don't know what the hazards are, what the strengths are, how strong your resilience is in terms of address certain disasters, then the planning and investment that goes into it may lead to more adaptation and will lead to more disasters, more impact than if you have information that helps you to better plan. So climate information is so critical in helping us to really plan and save lives, assets, and property. And it's been demonstrated that for every dollar of investment that you make in climate information and early warning systems, the returns is between 2 to roughly 36 to 40. And I've seen some assessment that even put it at 1 to 500. So climate information and early warning system is not only a critical input to decision making, but it's also a very good business case. It's very good business. Thank you.
$1 invested, $36 to $40 coming back, or even up to $500 coming back. That's massive. That's massive. Do you see governments realizing this return on investment? Do you see that growing as extreme weather increases? Do you see? Is the screen frozen?
Oh, sorry, I mean,
Yes, Joseph.
can you repeat the question? The link was a bit weak.
I just was wondering, are folks, and when I say folks, let's say policymakers and investors and capital holders, are they realizing the return on investment of climate early warning? You said $1 invested, 36 to 40 coming back, or even up to $500 coming back for every dollar invested.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I mean, until disaster strikes you, you really wouldn't appreciate the relevance of climate information and early warning systems. And so in some places like the Caribbean and areas where, let's say, hurricanes are so critical to their survival, they really get the message. In other places, the business case has not been really established. And I think the message and the way we message, the way we quantify is very, very important in really getting the buy-in of those who make the very important decisions on investments. And the case has been that in the past, it's mostly meteorologists or climate scientists that drive the message. But then we are beginning to see economists and other disciplines getting into the field and beginning to monetize the kind of forecast that we provide. And so I think the message is coming up, but it hasn't really gotten to a point. The political support that is needed is not at the level and pace that one would wish for. So I think we have a lot of work to do to really convey these economic messages, and also the in terms of saving of lives and property and assets is very, very important to monetize this and then put them in the proper perspective that the politicians and those who make the important decisions can really understand and use this in decision making. Thank you.
Interesting, Joseph. Makes me think that Andrea and I need to have a bit of a chat about using the sustainable asset valuation or SAVI to run some simulations on costs, avoided costs of early warning. Andrea, a trick question for you, if I may. Imagine we are the 18th of March, 2020, okay? And let me tell the listeners first that you are an expert on systems thinking and systems dynamics. You are the expert in systems thinking and systems dynamics. We're the 18th of March, and you are sitting at the European Central Bank with Christine Lagarde, the head of the ECB, and you have 5 minutes with her. What will you tell her that she will ask for a systemic and systems simulation to better foresee the play out of the pandemic emergency purchasing program?
Well, it's a tricky question. I guess it's not an easy one. Well, in hindsight, knowing what has happened now, but also making use of simulations, I think I would stress the fact that we need to look at potential avoided costs from the interventions we want to implement, as well as the potential additional benefits, the gains, the net gains that we can generate out of intervening. And this connects very explicitly with what Joseph mentioned before. I mean, climate information and early warning systems are excellent at reducing costs. And so we need forecasts to understand what is the potential avoided cost. Same with any other policy intervention, same with any other infrastructure investment. We need to know how they contribute to reducing the cost of running a system. Otherwise, we end up with a system that is more and more expensive to run, and we don't have any money left to support the good investments, the one that bring us the extra growth that we may want, or the extra conservation for the environment that we may want, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, the other aspect is also that we need to look at the potential gains, right? And the private sector is engaging a lot more than the public sector in climate information and early warning systems, because they see a direct connection between the information they receive and their business, meaning aviation, shipping, and so on and so forth. They're all using this information, maybe not the best available information, maybe not the most sophisticated. We're talking here about different types of systems that can be set up independently, jointly, as cloud systems, and so on and so forth, that give information on how to optimize production and economic activity. So what I would say to Christine Lagarde is, we need forecasts to see direct, indirect, and induced outcomes of action. But then when we look at these actions, we need to consider impacts across sectors, across economic actors, because these are affected in different ways by these uncertain events, black swans events like the pandemic, we could say, as well as other more predictable ones, I would say, like climate hazards. They used to be a 1 in 100 years type of events, now they're 1 in 5 year type of events, right? Mm-hmm. And then out of that, we need to look at impacts across social, economic, and environmental indicators, because I think what Joseph mentioned before, when we have the larger range of economic returns, is where we start valuing economically, not only the economic outcomes, but also the social and environmental ones, which of course have impact on the economy and society as well. And then ultimately, we need to see the impacts over time, because we may have costs in the short term for addressing the pandemic, as well as investing in a big infrastructure for climate information and early warning systems, but these will stay. They have a long lifetime. And so we have the potential to accumulate benefits and accumulate avoided costs, freeing up resources over a number of years if we get this investment right. And so it's the same concept we apply to climate change vulnerability that we also apply to the pandemic. If we get it right now, we have a lot to profit from in the medium and longer term.
So I'm Christine Lagarde, and I said, this is very nice to hear, Andrea. What is the system? What system should I be most worried about?
Well, in this case, if you look at the pandemic, it's a global and national and local. So it's the whole system. We're talking about planetary boundaries. Yeah?
Very nice, Andrea, but I'm worried about Europe. So in a post-pandemic fund, where is as a simulation and systems thinker, where do you see the first pressure point?
Well, one is in increasing costs for addressing this pandemic, and the fact that there is little leeway. In the way we have managed the economy, we haven't really accumulated much that can serve as a buffer. So we need to invest in avoiding damage to begin with, in being more resilient to a pandemic, to climate, to all these external, we call them external, but they're part of the system. We create them in a way, right? Climate change is driven by us primarily. The pandemic was driven by us, and now we have an interconnected economy and how we deal with nature. So we need to start addressing these vulnerabilities, regardless of where they come from, regardless of whether these are economic, think of the 2008 crisis, or whether these are social or environmental. We need to start addressing these as they impact costs. If we have an increase in running costs for our economy, then we tie our hands. We have much less flexibility in addressing the challenges.
I like the term running costs. Andrea, that resonates with me. And I presume you mean, I'm still Christine, by the way. I presume you mean running cost is equivalent to debt.
Well, parts of it, yes. Yes, I think about infrastructure, roads, could be buildings, it could be power generation. The more we build, the more we have to maintain, right? And that maintenance cost is representing a larger and larger share of the budget we have at country level. If the economy doesn't grow enough with the system we have now, we cannot cover these costs. We cannot have enough resources to renew this infrastructure. It's the same type of discussion we are having with natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions. We make one investment, they give us several benefits, including climate resilience, for instance. So we have to start connecting the dots and finding these multiplier effects. And I'm sure Joseph will connect this to climate information and early warning systems when we talk about multi-hazard systems. So that with one investment, you can inform different types of decisions according to different type of hazards that can emerge. So we need to become smarter at identifying and leveraging these synergies.
Picking up on the hazards, A trick question for Joseph now. And I'm going to incorporate one of the questions that our listeners are asking us, and that is, what would be adequate climate early warning systems that would mitigate the impact of the present pandemic? And Joseph, while you answer that, here's the trick question coming in. You are 1 week before us. You're in early July, and you're sitting in Kenya, and you're talking to a bunch of people, policymakers, investors, citizens, bunch of people, and they're worried about three things. They're worried about the locusts, they're worried about the long prevailing drought, and they're worried about COVID-19. What would you say to make the case that the post-pandemic recovery would be much easier if they had invested in climate early warning?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting question and one that is very close to my heart. As a matter of fact, the Greater Horn of Africa, where Kenya is located, is one of the most interesting places where climate variability and change is really devastating or impacting on livelihoods. And what is very interesting is that at the end of 2019, there was this insurgence of locust invasion in the whole region. And while they were trying to address this, they lost a lot of crops and the associated malnutrition and other poverty cycle being enhanced as a result of the losses of these livelihoods. And also the drought, which also has created a lot of problems in the region. And on top of the COVID-19 makes it like a super storm that has impacted on the region. You know? So there are early warning systems in place, but then we need to rethink the effectiveness of a single early warning system. We need to look at the notion of a multi-hazard. The cost effectiveness of looking at the multi-hazard early warning system is very, very significant, because with the same base infrastructure, you'll be able to address different hazards. You know, a platform that is established, the communication infrastructure, the observing systems are basically designed in a way that they can manage multi-hazards. You know? So all you need to do is really look at the elements of what we call impact-based forecasting and begin to change or translate the climate hazards into sector-specific information that are actionable. People can act on it. You look at the impact instead of just the climate variables. Because it's well established that when people can understand what implications would be for them for a given forecast, then they will act on it. For instance, the case of Hurricane Haiyan in the Philippines. A lot of people died not because the forecast was not correct, but the way the forecast was packaged was such that they didn't really get, they didn't really kick them to really run for their lives. So a lot of the men stayed behind to protect their properties. And then the storm cell that came in killed so many people. So the way we look at it in terms of the impacts, instead of just the basic climate variables, are very, very important. And it's well established that impact-based forecasting saves a lot of lives compared to the traditional early warning systems. So this is the new thinking and the way the future designs are going to look like, by using multi-hazards, impact-based forecasting, and people-centered. Let me put it in that context. People-centered end-to-end early warning systems bring out the maximum impact that one will expect from an intervention. So my message to the various actors or audiences will be: one, early warning system is good business, it saves lives, and it need not be too complicated for you to act. More importantly, also what we call forecast-based actions that needs to be integrated. The forecast-based actions are very, very critical, and particularly I will look at forecast-based financing, which enables people to take action proactively instead of waiting for disasters to happen and then we look for humanitarian intervention. In this case, when a trigger is reached, interventions are put in place. Let's say cash transfers are provided so that the herdsmen can either sell their cows or harvest their crops ahead of time before the disaster happens. And it's well established, even in Kenya, the Greater Horn of Africa, and other places, that once you do that, you save a lot of lives. You save money in terms of the poverty cycles. It's been established that it reduces a lot of the poverty cycles that is associated with disasters, where people have to borrow to undertake actions for disaster recovery. So these are some of the key elements that I think will be very, very important in terms of how we design and think in future, how we can better prepare for disasters and then build back better. And this is very, very critical. With impact-based forecasting and forecast-based financing, it establishes the resilience and the capability for us to really reduce the impact of disasters. And that helps us in a way to prepare and build back better. So these would be the key ideas that I will articulate to the audience.
We're going to come back to impact-based and forecast-based financing, Joseph. But I'm going to move over to Andrea for a minute and ask Andrea to tell us one example, one highlight from your work where a government has made economic decisions taking into account systemic forecasting. Give us an example.
Oh, there are many cases and in many different sectors. I mean, in a way, climate change is being embedded in planning and policy, not maybe for designing specific investments on an annual basis out of the budget, but it's being embedded into planning and policy. We see that from many of the NDCs and many of the modeling assessments that we have done to support planning for green economy and green growth. We have the case of Indonesia, we have the case of Kenya that already started with the climate resilience strategy back in 2012. So we have many governments that started embedding data on climate. Mauritius is another case, to figure out what would be the best pattern, the best way forward for investments. And this may focus on resilient infrastructure, it may focus on agriculture planning, it covers many different areas. One common element that I think is important is that in this specific context, or at least the work I've been embedded in, it was planning for medium to longer term development. And so the role of climate information systems, more than early warning, was about how to improve performance on a monthly basis or on an annual basis. Not only how to respond to the crisis or how to prepare for a crisis, which is most of what you get out of the more traditional view of early warning systems. So in a way, how can we make so that an early warning system helps people every day, right? When to plant your seeds, when to harvest, as Joseph said, not only in the context of an upcoming disaster, but also based on seasonality, based on changes in rainy seasons. An example of that in Cambodia, work we've done with the National Council for Sustainable Development, aligned with the work of the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Environment, to understand in the highlands and in the lowlands along the Mekong River in the northern part of the country, what would be the best way to train and help farmers understanding how the postponement of the rainy season affects their livelihoods. So how could they do intercropping with peas, for instance, depending on what they're growing already, whether it's cassava or rice, to make sure they have a stable income throughout the year, rather than skipping one growing season and then having problems economically. So we see examples at all levels, difficult to pinpoint one, but we see many at national level and landscape level, where this is becoming more and more mainstream. Where we need more commitment is, rather than doing a piecemeal approach in specific areas for specific studies or policies, is in mainstreaming this in all policies, in all policy processes at the national level. That is where the infrastructure, the multi-hazard systems, for instance, could profit, could really leverage efforts at the national level. So when this is embedded in ongoing practices and processes, that's where the gain can be achieved, and that's where we need more commitment, I think, at this stage.
Interesting points, Andrea. I'm picking up questions from our listeners. So there's Benjamin that's asking how to get the private sector to take note of what you and Joseph have been saying. And I'm wondering whether Joseph has some advice to offer, especially breaking down impact-based and forecast-based financing. And then Andrea, if you might come in soon after that, I'm looking at the question from Alessandro, who's asking a very important question that's very close to me, which is when you look at payment for ecosystem services and carbon credit markets, the end of the chain is always rightly lost. What you were one of the co-authors of the guidance for the Green Climate Fund on financing early warning systems. What could you draw from that, Andrea, to respond to the question from Alessandro? But Joseph, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so to come back to what I was saying previously, impact-based forecasting came about because of the difficulty in people understanding and acting on forecasts. The traditional forecast will be there will be 20 millimeters of rainfall, the temperature will be 35 degrees, and people cannot act on them. But if you are able to translate it that the rainfall will lead to disruptions in, let's say, transportation, or it could lead to diseases. This number of people will die, or you lose 50% of your investments as a result of the flooding. Where a normal market woman, let's say, if there's too much rain and the market is disrupted, you cannot go to sell your stuff. Or there will be mosquitoes. A lot of mosquitoes come as a result of the flooding and all that. Then people begin to understand that they need to act. So that is why impact-based forecasting is becoming very, very important. Like the case that I gave in the Philippines, where a lot of people died because of the way the packaging of the forecast was done. So impact-based forecast enables us to act. It's very actionable. I remember one of my experience in the Maasai. It was a time I used to work with ICPAC. We went to the Maasai. We did. They also have indigenous forecasters. We combined that with a scientific forecast. We had a consensus forecast. We danced. We appreciated their culture and look at how their indigenous knowledge can be blended with the science, and they were able to really believe the message that we are telling them. But if you give them a forecast, they really don't know you. Why should they believe you? They will believe an elder or an indigenous forecaster in the village than somebody who is doing the forecasting at the Met Service. They really don't know you. So the belief system and the way people act on information is based on trust. It doesn't matter how accurate your forecast is. So impact-based forecasting takes into account, all these elements. How to make people act on the information that you are providing, because it's based on impact. What will happen to them if they take no action? And that has been demonstrated to be very, very effective. And in terms of the unlocking the private sector, the climate services and early warning system sector is very, very profitable. One of the drivers of climate information and early warning system is ICT. It's ICT has enabled us to do things we could not do in the past. From modeling using cloud infrastructure to model the computing, the forecasting system, the climate, doing impact assessment, observing the oceans, observing the atmosphere. All of this is a lot of business. As a matter of fact, about 75% of investments goes into this kind of infrastructure. So private sector, especially those in IT, there's a big market, for the IT sector to get involved. And then we're looking at the value chain, those who package information, those who can market the information, those who can really add value to the information, like insurance and finance and medicine and agriculture. All of these provide opportunity for the private sector. As a matter of fact, within the GCF portfolio, it is only 25% that goes into modernization of net services. The 75% is on applications like agriculture, water resources, health, infrastructure. These are the trends. These are what the countries are asking for. And there's a big market that the private sector can come in and add that value that is needed. So it's really a very big thing if you really appreciate and look at it more specifically in terms of the opportunities that it creates. It's really, really massive. And the market is becoming very, very significant. And it's expected to grow as climate change gathers pace. There are more disasters, insurance products need to be designed and developed, electricity, renewable energy, logistics, and all that coming together. There's a very big market that is beginning to unlock.
Oshani, you're muted.
Hearing you, Joseph, clearly as the predictability of the forecasts improve, we'll be seeing more financing mechanisms like the social impact bonds, the impact bond family, green bonds at the project level coming into play. I can just see that they're happening. Andrea, the question on the PES and carbon credit markets that you see in the chat from Alessandro, very pertinent. Thoughts?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Alessandro, for your question. It's a very good one. I'll provide some answers, but I would like Joseph to confirm or disregard my answers and provide his own, because this is really the core business of the GCF, really trying to get projects ongoing and happening, or going and happening at the country level. So my view is that we are undergoing a massive change in the business model for providing access to this type of infrastructure and services. We come from a situation where we needed hardware, physical hardware in the Met departments. We needed workstations, we need servers to run the models and so on. And that is very, first of all, money intensive and infrastructure driven. Two, a system now where we have these shared technologies, cloud systems and so on and so forth, and where we need more of an end-to-end approach, like Joseph mentioned before, which is user-driven. So the goal is not really on developing the infrastructure to collect the data and process the data. The goal now is moving towards providing a type of information that can be used to take action. So translating the information on climate indicators to actionable activities for farmers on a daily basis, as well as for governments and private sector to respond to hazards, climate hazards. And so there are three main areas, I think, that need to be considered to generate a stronger pipeline of projects here. The first one is increasing capacity. This is a sector, an area where technology is improving massively. And if you have staff at the government that were trained in these topics, not 40 years ago, even 10 years ago, they still need to work a lot and learn and catch up with the latest developments. Think of cloud computing, the evolutions of models, and so on and so forth, the need for downscaling of models and climate information. So there is a need for continued and continuous capacity building. But capacity building not only on the climate side, but also capacity building on the systems analysis, because we need to be able to design these systems to provide information on social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And so that's a whole different challenge, right? We need to do knowledge integration, which is not what experts in these fields normally do. They have very high depth of knowledge in one area, but they need to be able to exchange with others in a more proactive way. Then the other areas that I see being important are more about implementation. So in addition to developing the infrastructure, as I mentioned before, we need to create those synergies. We need to make sure that we create these multi-hazards early warning systems, so that we can, again, change the way things are being done, with the government being the repository of knowledge that can be made available to a variety of actors and stakeholders. Now, in this way, we avoid the duplication of efforts that Joseph mentioned before, where the private sector is making investments on its own. But it's not in the more advanced, it's not in the more societal type of outcomes that the government wants to achieve. It's mostly to maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness of their own businesses. And then the last point is to invest in these areas to create these new financial instruments. Joseph mentioned forecast-based activities. One of these is impact-based or forecast-based financing. Now, the game changer in this area is that if organizations like the GCF and others help developing these tools, basically they're creating a revenue stream for those that want to invest in prevention. Because as Joseph mentioned early on, the value of these infrastructure, climate information early warning systems, is particularly high when disaster comes. Then you realize what was the value of that potential investment that we could have implemented early on. But if we're using forecasts to determine when payments should be made, even if there is no impact on infrastructure, the payment will be released. So if I'm an investor and I decide to invest in improving climate resilience, and I have that type of forecast-based insurance or payments, then I would say I want to invest right away, because as soon as the next climate event strikes, and it's meeting the or matching the parameters for the payment to be released, maybe I will have no impact on infrastructure because I've invested in resilience before, but nevertheless, I will receive a payment. And so again, it creates a revenue stream for being proactive rather than reactive. And that is a massive game changer that can allow a lot more projects to be realized without having an external push, without having a push from the donors or from the government. It becomes something that makes sense to do from an investor, a household, a private sector point of view.
Joseph, closing remarks from you on that, please.
Yeah, I think Andrea is right. The landscape is really emerging. There are a lot of opportunities that enables one to really use simulations and other knowledge to really maximize the impact on the ground. Particularly, like I was referring to ICT as a driver of most of the innovation that we are seeing in the field. We look at artificial intelligence that has impacted a lot in terms of the predictability of forecast. IBM is using artificial intelligence to improve wind forecasts in some areas where energy is very critical. And we've seen improvement in the performance of about 30% compared to the baseline. And this is hugely significant. Internet of Things is also bringing down the cost of investment. I mean, like classical observing network is about 90% cheaper when you move to Internet of Things and AI-based systems. So we are beginning to see reduction in the cost, but improvement in the performance of the forecasting system. And this is very, very huge. The other important thing in terms of private sector way to understand is that in the field of meteorology or climate science, most of the tools and the methods are open source. It's developed, taxpayers' money, they develop the system through the universities. A lot of open source tools are widely available on the market. And that is what is being used to generate a lot of the profits. So you don't need too much to start a business in climate services. You need a laptop and internet connection. And all the resources are available online. So this creates a playing field for everybody to be part of this big market. Whether you're in Africa, in America, it doesn't really matter. But the tools are free. You need to know that you need to have the knowledge, you need to have internet connection, and then a laptop, and you can do a lot of things online. And we have demonstrated this in a number of countries. In my previous work, we did some work in the African states using very low budget to demonstrate the usability of some of these systems. So my concluding remark is that this is so important. It's so important. We cannot take this for granted. This is a very exciting time that we all need to embrace technology to advance climate action. In particular, to give you a little bit of perspective, when the COVID began to impact on a number of systems, it also impacted on observing networks. About 90% of the observation network that feeds into the global forecasting system was down because they are manually managed. Yeah. So this has jeopardized the capability of the global forecasting system, which most of our logistics depend on. Yeah. So COVID has a significant impact on this infrastructure and the ability of countries and businesses to be able to forecast and make better planning. And so we need to transition from this old system into IoT-based systems that are automated, and then also artificial intelligence and cloud computing that are location independent and enable us to really be more efficient and effective in the way we deliver climate information. And the last point also, we need the political support. We need really leadership in this area. I mean, the scientists are doing a lot. As a matter of fact, the science has advanced a lot, but then we need leaders. We need leaders that are committed to climate action, leaders that really understand the need to invest in climate information and early warning, because it saves lives, it builds resilience, and then it secures the livelihoods of the future generation. So this is so critical. And I think the message here is that we all need to be on board, but we really need leadership to drive this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. So the takeaway message is you don't need a lot of money. You need knowledge, you need a laptop, and you need an internet connection. On that note, I would like to close this webinar and say buckets and buckets of thank yous to Andrea and Joseph for joining me this morning, taking the time to share your knowledge with us. It's been a delight. Thank you, Sophia, and we will reconnect soon.